Hello, and welcome to our HR Brew launch event. I'm John Del Signor, editor of HR Brew. HR Brew started just a few weeks ago on October 4th, and we could not be more pleased with your reception. Today, we have the opportunity to bring you this special edition event unpacking the complexities of the current state of HR and people operations. Over the past few years, HR professionals have found themselves occupying daunting roles in corporate culture. Today, we'll spend some time reflecting on the changes brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic and social justice movements, while looking to the future of the HR department in workplaces that have forever changed. Before we dive in, I'd like to thank our sponsor, JustWorks, for making today's event and the launch of our HR Brew newsletter possible. I also want to encourage everyone who is not currently a subscriber to sign up with the link being sent in the chat to receive our HR newsletter. It is free. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Carrie Brown, who served as Global Head of Transformational Change and Future of Work at software giant SAP for over 15 years. Carrie is an industry veteran and thought leader, and together we'll discuss where the HR industry is now and where it is heading. Welcome, Carrie.
Thanks, John. I'm really excited to be here.
We are thrilled to have you with us today for our very first event. So, as I said, our main topic of conversation today is the current state of HR. Where are we now? Where are we going? And we have a little under 30 minutes to cover those questions, which should be plenty of time to answer them in full. But before we do so, I'd like to start by mentioning your recent article in Forbes, in which you posed this question in the headline, "Should we resign ourselves to the Great Resignation?" In it, you wrote, quote, "An individual crisis changes individual behavior. Worldwide crises cause lasting social and cultural consequences. The pandemic completely upended the employee experience, and while many employers continue to monitor productivity, most didn't devote nearly the same amount of effort to soliciting real-time, real-world feedback from remote workers about the challenges, struggles, and stresses they were facing." Can you expand on that and let us know from your perspective what else HR leaders can do to stop employees from running to the exits?
Sure, it's a question that's active right now. In that article, I cited that 15 million people left their jobs this year, which is an enormous number of people. And if you look at the start of the pandemic, if you think about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all of us became very basic, looking for toilet paper and food and shelter. And if you look at organizations, they did the same thing. There's a Brewer's hierarchy looks at business, and organizations were just settling in, figuring out how to you know, be and live through the initial pieces of change. So what happened initially was, while we all reacted and went home, we joked, at least for those of us who were office workers, we joked a couple of weeks ago that, if you'd said to somebody as a leadership team, "Hey, let's move every employee in the world to their house in 2 weeks," we'd say, "No way." So everyone really pivoted quickly, but we didn't necessarily have the means to listen and learn from what people were experiencing as that happened. And we're still learning from that. So if I expand upon it, if I think about what we could have done more of and what some organizations have done, is look at how to listen more. It was interesting. Qualtrics as an organization was providing the opportunity for businesses to listen to employees free and survey them. And the survey responses were coming in at 70 and 90%, not 30, which is typically really high for an employee survey. So, what we can be doing more is keep listening, because things keep changing, and what people want and need is changing as we continue to pivot and grow and shift as organizations.
And speaking of the Great Resignation, I understand you yourself has some personal news to share in regards to that.
I do. I joined the 15 million. My role, I have been in this space, in this community for a really long time. I was a customer for 12 years of SAP, looking at how organizational change and how to help employees shift through their own transformations as organizations changed around them. I was at SAP for 17 and a half years, so a long, long time. And the team that I put together about a year ago, I was asked to build a team to look at our own transformation. And the board members and team were really looking at how SAP could continue to pivot from on-premise to cloud, which they're doing. And you can read about that in the marketplace on a different conversation. And that afforded me the opportunity to build a really fantastic team to set out the strategy for how to approach that. And as it shifted to operationalizing, I had the chance to either continue in that space or look at other roles internally or join the brave new world. And I chose to actually join the 15 million and look at what I might do as my next chapter of my career. And so I am exploring that now, which is exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I love your title, by the way, the head of transformational change and future of work. It must have been hard to give up a title that cool.
It's it we have the privilege in a lot of roles at SAP of really trying to say what it is that we do that makes the most sense to the rest of the world. And so at times enablement was in my title, future of work was in my title, change, and there's certain words that resonate with people as they're trying to tackle what it is we're tackling. And transformational change is what the rest of the world is doing and what we were trying to get done. Future of work, it's interesting. We started exploring that probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And actually, the digital workplace was what we originally looked at it as, because digital 2.0 was on every magazine, and what it meant for people wasn't clear. And so we started exploring with customers and partners alike, how does this digital thing change jobs? And that's really my litmus test for any change is, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to me as a person? And how do we as an organization help that person be successful in their job? So future of work now is a hashtag we see everywhere, but it's something that even in the last year, I think has been very highly associated with remote work. And when in fact, future of work really looks at demographics changes, the mass flow of baby boomers out of the workforce, which COVID has accelerated, the change of demographics of having such a large percentage of millennials and now Gen Z joining the workforce, but also how do AI and machine learning and robotics fit in? Safety became a big consideration for a lot of organizations during COVID. And so where do you support employees from a safety perspective with drones or other considerations also becomes part of future of work.
Mm-hmm. And before we get more to the future of work, I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about your career arc, especially for those who are just starting out in this field and would look to where you are now at this point as a place they would love to get to.
I think of it as, how do you take your side hustle and make it your day job? So, my day job when I was at a customer was helping with projects. Actually, far back, initially I was in marketing and looking at how quality could happen across organizations. So for those of you who are old enough to know, Kaizen and Deming and TQM and ISO was all part of my past. And then as SAP became part of it, was really looking at the transformation that's driven by major organizational changes that come with technology and re-engineering. And then for me, really the future of work piece that became a big part of the context for my work, one was in response to the world happening around me, but also understanding and looking at where those things that were brain candy for me and curiosity for me could become additive and complementary to what my day job was, whether that was being a consultant or leading a team. Those pieces of content became something that could inform and shape and help me do my day job. And then really, frankly, they became my day job. So my advice would be, look at things that you are curious about, that you can then be passionate about because they matter to you. And that brings with it an authenticity and an enthusiasm that is really infectious. And for me, that allowed me to explore topics that I find really interesting as part of what I get paid to do.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Gen Z employees and younger workers who are finding their place in the workforce now. We did a survey recently with Harris Poll that showed a really big gap between Gen Z employees' faith in HR and their ability to solve problems compared to older employees. Gen Z was really an outlier in a lack of faith in HR's ability to fix or adequately help them in the workplace. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how that trust can be built with new young employees, and how can HR do better to attract young employees?
And I saw that article on trust falls. A lot of managing change to me is about building trust. Here's what we know now, here's what we don't know now, here's what we're going to know what we don't know now. And we've all been in a state of change. The last 18 months, everybody learned something new. Everybody changed the way they worked. Even if you were an essential worker and your actual job didn't change, the way you did it changed. And I'm not surprised at the change in, or the shift in the volume of trust depending on generationally where somebody is in their career, because the experience that they have is different. The people who've been working for a long time have a known predictable entity in HR, and what they think it is and what they think it should be and can do for them. And newer people with less exposure to that have their own expectations of what that could and should look like. I also think HR has changed tremendously. And so if you look in the last 18 months, HR has been brought absolutely front and center to help with how individually and collectively we navigate through the work shifts that we've needed to address. To answer your question specifically on how do you build trust for the next generation, listen and be there. Show up. The transient nature of work now has changed so much in that the average tenure of the workforce is 3.8 years. And so the volume of choice that we all have, whether it's a newer worker, in the newer generations in the workforce, or if it's a more mature worker who now, because they have their kids out of high school or out of college, that volume of choice is there for every employee to make. So I would say for every HR person, for every generation, it's how do you build that trust by showing up and listening and responding in a tangible way that the employee can see that you're listening. And with that, just like in any relationship, that trust is going to grow.
Mhm. And in terms of attracting young employees, especially during this labor shortage, how much is upskilling and reskilling and offering training opportunities to young workers? How crucial do you see that being?
I think that's crucial for every worker, for sure. For the younger workers who, there's so many people who've been looking at changing their careers. You look at the hospitality and service industry. So many, we've all watched on television programs and on the news how many people are shifting into work that is perhaps more technologically oriented versus service oriented as they had to, and then have said, "Hey, this is a chance." So that upskilling and reskilling is giving people the opportunity to find new places to be and new places to stay. If you look historically in the last 20 years, organizations have had the luxury of having really strong talent in place. So the investment as an organization was less. If you look back 20 odd years, there were lots of development programs and rotational programs. I'm Gen X. For my generation, those had gone away. And if you look sort of 7 years ago or so, they started to come in with millennials coming in, and they're continuing to grow because the need to build and grow talent is much more on the responsibility on the shoulders of each organization. So upskilling and reskilling are critical. Also, the other piece of that is we all had to learn how to learn differently. You and I are doing something which is super familiar now to any child in school and any adult at home who's talking to their family or their friends. But this was a new skill set, and how to continue to listen and learn virtually successfully. Learning's absolutely a piece in terms of upskilling that will become a place to grow and a place to stay, but also a place to springboard from. So the expectation that somebody will be in a career for 20 and 30 years with one organization is unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. And so I know in talking, for example, with a lot of organizations, they look at where is an employee really fully capable of being at full capacity. And organizations I know that used to say it was 7 or 8 years where an employee was absolutely firing on all cylinders, and they needed to get that down to 6 or to 4, so that as somebody comes in, they can really have an impact earlier and quicker. I know I'm in Vancouver right now, which is my hometown, and Lululemon, which we all may be familiar with, has their manifesto. And one of the things that they used to do for employees was say, "Where do you want to be in 5 years, and how do we help you get there?" Even if where that wasn't with that company, because it meant that you were getting the most engaged and inspired employee while they were there, and giving them the opportunity to look at how to grow themselves in that organization or beyond. So the same thing now I think is true, is how do you give people the opportunity to be their best, strongest, growing self? And that will make where they are much more attractive for as long as possible.
And these sorts of priorities for HR leaders are also happening at organizations that are still all remote or partially remote and hybrid. And I know one thing that a lot of people are grappling with is how do you organize a workflow in a hybrid work environment where some people are remote and some people are in person without the people who are fully remote being left behind? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. It's interesting actually for a lot of the people who were fully remote, COVID was a gift. And for people who were previously fully remote, I've always been a hybrid worker myself. I didn't have an office at SAP in the 17 years I was there. Prior to that, when I was at Coca-Cola, I had an office, and where our team was compared to another team was really meaningful. And so I've been in both of those kinds of scenarios. And if I look now, the last 18 months for those people who were previously really the outlier, they've had the chance to see the faces and reactions of their peers via virtual work scenarios like we're in right now. I think the interesting thing for organizations is looking at how do they continue to um, take the best of what we've had in the last 18 months. So, for example, if you have an event that you're doing that is a hybrid event, having the people who are in the room all on camera as well. So you're not with a room that is looking at each other face to face, and the remote people are trying to listen, to the sound in the sky that is invisible in that room, but actually signing into meetings like we're doing right now for those people who are in the office along with those people who aren't, so that the experience is more shared, and that person who is still remote doesn't get forgotten and go back into the abyss, but rather stays as part of the engagement and the conversation. So that's if there's a chance to bring people together too, I think the real opportunity now is to look at when and how and why we put people together. So there was a long time where people were together because it was just habit. If you look historically at why organizations came together when they didn't have the kind of technology we do now, if we had invented offices, 100 years ago with the kind of technology we have, we wouldn't have the commuting all at the same time. We wouldn't have meeting rooms with walls where you couldn't see each other. We would have designs like we're seeing get created naturally now. So understanding when and how to bring people together, and ideally physically having everybody together at some point in time, so that camaraderie and that teamwork can come together, so that when you're remote, you have that trust and you have that shared experience.
Okay, let's talk about the future, which I think your answer contains. The present is also going to be the future in regards to these sorts of hybrid and virtual and new workplace arrangement. Can you tell us, and be as specific as possible, what you think the future of work holds in the next 5 years?
Well, I'm glad we have only 12 minutes. Just kidding. Um, what I think in the next 5 years, we are going to see a continued flow of people through organizations. So if you look at 2021, it was expected to be the peak of retirement of boomers at 21,000 a day. And I think we'll continue to see a strong movement of people. Pensions aren't really present, so the expectation that people would stay and be committed to an organization is something of the past for most companies. So I think we'll continue to see a flow through of people. I think that we'll also see the flexibility that we have, many of us have learned to like about remote work and like about the kind of hybrid work that we have, be a part of how people shape and form their families and shape and form their careers. And that will test and stretch for organizations. Where can people work? How can people work? It also gives them opportunity to recruit entirely differently. It gives them the chance to recruit to more diverse audiences, more diverse geographies than perhaps they had access to in the past. So I think you'll see the opportunity for people to have what would have seemed like an assignment. Those assignments can become more permanent, where they may not be in the same state or the same area. In terms of the hybrid workplace, I think it's going to stay. I think we'll, like anything, we'll flow back and forth. And when we have full choice, we'll look at, from a safety perspective, once we have full choice, picking those moments to come together and spending the time and the money where we believe that's going to have the impact to build a culture, to build an organization, to build a relationship, and then managing sensibly around where is that just excess spend or excess cost, or excess hassle for the employee that doesn't really help anybody get the right things done. And so I would say in the next 5 years, we'll see more technology come into play as well. There's certainly a talent demand and a talent drain in certain spaces. So I think that the technology side of dark manufacturing and support around co-robotics is looking at where and how to support where talent isn't, where talent isn't voluminous. So that I think will grow as well. And then we'll hit a bit of a stasis, really, because in the next 5 years, we'll see where the millennial and Gen Zs will have established themselves as truly being the largest part of the organization and the workforce, even greater than they are now. And boomers will have pretty much moved through to the partial work role that many of them are playing, but they won't have the same footprint that they've had for the last 20 years. So I think the next 3 years we'll see a lot of change. In the last two of the five, we'll see a new stasis.
You mentioned in there the remote, decentralized workplace, creating more opportunities to have a diverse workforce. And obviously, diversity is one huge challenge that many HR departments have been tasked with fixing and addressing. And I wondered if you could speak about just one piece of this challenge, which is obviously too huge to get to in the time remaining. But you mentioned something about your work in regards to autism, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that and how that might relate to the broader challenge HR faces when it comes to making a diverse workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. SAP has an autism at work program that some of you may have seen in the press. There's some other organizations as well that have looked at that, and it was a commitment by the organization to look at where neurodiversity could come into the workforce in a place where the skills and talents of that talent pool are really being put to their best application. And it's not a matter of saying we'll be charitable, if you will, by bringing in different people. It's really how do we benefit by bringing in the skill sets where those skill sets are really going to be truly complementary and an additive and a win for the organization to have as a part of that. Um, if I look at that as an example, there are now, the scenarios for individual support, where people are working from, how they're working, what familial support that they have, what structural support they have, the kinds of choices where individuals might have needed to be in a city versus not in a city. Talent now can be reached where they live and where they have those support structures around them, and still be able to join in to corporations and organizations from those places where either financially or personally they can thrive best. So, I know from a lot of organizations I've spoken to in the last 18 months, their eyes really opened up in terms of where they could get people to join their organizations from, where they had had talent challenges because they happened to be in a smaller town in the Midwest where an organization started and they didn't necessarily have that talent, resident in that or in that geographical space. Similarly, the hybrid workspace has seen a lot of people move back to smaller towns or family areas because they could. And so the notion that you have to have somebody in your office beside you every day and you can only hire people within 3 to 5 to 10 miles of where you are is not real anymore. And so the kind of talent that you can make comfortable and make successful in your organizations and invite into your organizations is much greater than it was, and we've proven that and know that. So it's an opportunity certainly for diversity that we weren't necessarily exploring as deeply before.
Yeah, I agree. There's tremendous potential there. And I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned about how you see, and many agree, that HR has really moved front and center in the past couple of years. And at the same time, I was looking at this SAGE report that showed that 59% of company leaders surveyed said that their HR leader did not have an actual leading role in the organization. In other words, the leader of the HR department was not executive level, was not in the C-suite. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how important you think it is for HR leaders to be at that executive strategic level, and what HR leaders can do in order to get there and stay there.
I think it's vital. I think it's absolutely essential. If I look, there's a study, gosh, it was probably about 8 years ago that Accenture did, that asked what percent of a time does a CEO reach to each of their CXO leaders to get guidance in a strategic decision, and super high was the CFO. Financially, where do we go? Then the chief operating officer. If you look at the CIO used to be the nerdy person in the basement who made sure the phones and the wiring was working. They've become an innovation partner. If you look at your chief marketing officer, how do we build and grow customer relationships? It was only 24% of the time that the CHRO was being looked to in that space. Not enough. And if you look what's happened in the last 18 months, HR has been brought quickly, rapidly into the room to address how to tackle the situations we have with people where we took for granted a lot of the scenarios of how we work, where we work, all of the considerations we've been talking about on this call and for 18 months. Don't leave the room. It's not like leaders weren't thinking about how do people function, but they weren't challenged to have to think about it in the same kind of depth or detail that they've had to be able to do in the last 18 months. So, one, if you've been invited into the room as an HR person, don't invite yourself out. You've demonstrated the need to be there and stay and keep that spot. And the continued need to listen and to have empathy and to be aware around people as you talk about the great resignation, as you talk about the volume of choice. The Business Roundtable, which is a group of 200 CEOs who are advisors to the US president, many of whom are global companies, so it's not just a US conversation. They changed the definition of a corporation from being solely based around profits about 2 years ago to looking at both the consumer and employee experience and satisfaction. So the need for us to be aware for how to make employees succeed and thrive is certainly much more top of mind. And that empathy, which was not a new thought, is now something that has to be part of our thought all the time to get the kind of retention and attraction that we're looking for as organizations. So, you're in the room now by necessity. Stay. For many, that was already starting to happen. The shift from transactional HR to strategic HR had been happening over the last really 8 to 10 years, significant in the last 5, similarly to how IT did that. IT went from being the do I have a computer to how do I innovate and become, look at how many organizations define themselves as an experience or as a software company when in fact they're in retail or in other businesses where what we experience is really very technologically driven. And that's been accelerated for sure in the last 18 months as well. HR now has truly a seat at the table and keep it and continue to show the importance and be part of the conversation versus deferring to leaders who might have a different P&L responsibility, but are certainly thinking about the people who work for them and be a partner in them doing that.
That's great. So we just have a couple minutes left. So I thought we would ask 1 or 2 questions from readers who submitted questions in advance. And I wanted to ask this question from an anonymous reader on the subject of mental health. The reader asks, with the rise of mental health issues, how can we support our employees and give them empathy and space while also protecting business initiatives? It seems like more and more I'm having employees come to me with mental health concerns for help, but their performance starts to suffer, and we have to choose between giving them a break after a time or letting them go.
That's a really good question. Mental health, I surmised at the start of COVID that once we got through the physical health challenges and being safe, that mental health would be the big next wave of challenges. And certainly I'm seeing that in organizations. I'm seeing that with anecdotal scenarios of friends, aside from the statistics you see in the paper. I would say that the earlier the better is how you can deal with mental health. So, that individual, that example of, you've got somebody where they're at their breaking point or they're at the point where their performance is suffering, it's likely that their mental health has been a challenge for some time. They're not at the I'm just tapping on the door, they're at the I'm banging on the door and I really have a challenge. So the earlier the better provides for more resiliency and more trust and more openness to support people and provide people with what they need before it's too late for them personally or professionally in terms of performance. It's a conversation that all too often is something we're not well equipped to have. I know in your recent dialogues in HR Brew around compassion fatigue, HR is certainly being tasked with that more than not. But I think that's an opportunity for every leader and manager. And so for HR, the opportunity is how do you provide and give support to all leaders and managers to become a multiplier to support around mental health so that one, it isn't the burden on just HR when it really is an HR situation, a performance situation, but rather how do I act as a coach and a support and a mentor as a leader and a manager to foster that kind of individual support and team support throughout an organization.
I love that. I think that's really helpful. the multiplier. Well, Carrie, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your time and for your invaluable insights. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a tremendously exciting time for HR. For all those strategic HR people who have been that leader, this is a chance for everyone else to join in. And for those who didn't have the chance, HR is more important than ever. The opportunity for us to shape and form how organizations work together and how people thrive, we're there, and let's take that opportunity and really make a difference. So thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Take care. We are so appreciative of you joining us today. We'd love to hear any feedback you have about today's program. We'll be sharing a brief survey in today's chat via email, and a special thank you to Carrie for the enlightening conversation. And I'd like to once again thank our sponsor, JustWorks, for their support of today's event and our newsletter. Make sure to tune in to our other vertical events, and we'll see you in HR Brew.